What I'm about to reveal in this video will completely change the way you see relationships, attraction, and influence. And I promise you've never heard this before. If you're an older man, confident in your experience, in your wisdom, in your life, there's one thing you don't realize. Younger women have psychological patterns, subtle behaviors, and emotional strategies that most men fall for without even knowing it. And the truth is, it's not about manipulation in the obvious sense. It's smarter, quieter, and far more effective. By the time this video ends, you're going to see the ways you've been responding unconsciously, the ways your instincts have been guiding you, and the ways you've been drawn in, often without realizing why. You're going to discover 5 psychological tricks that tap directly into your emotions, your desire, and even your sense of identity. Tricks so subtle that you'll wonder how you didn't notice them before. This is the kind of insight most men never hear. Most men never see themselves in these patterns, and most men never wake up to the influence happening right under their nose. If you think you're too experienced, too smart, too self-aware to fall for subtle psychological influence, think again. Because these techniques aren't about age, they're about human nature, and they hit all of us, especially older men who believe they're in control. They exploit instincts, emotions, and patterns you didn't even know you had, and they do it without force, without argument, and without you even noticing until you're already invested. So pay attention, watch closely, and don't blink, because by the end of this video, you won't just understand these tricks. You'll see yourself in them. You'll see the dynamics that have been guiding your attention and desire, and you'll finally know how to take back control. What you're about to learn isn't taught anywhere. Most men will never hear this, but you're about to, and that knowledge will change everything. Let's start with something that might feel uncomfortable to hear. The first trick, the one that most older men never even recognize, is strategic vulnerability. And when I say strategic, I don't mean it's fake exactly. It's subtle, it's selective, and it's designed to create a very specific response, one that older men almost instinctively fall into without realizing it. Vulnerability in its rawest form is beautiful. But what we're talking about here isn't simply being open, it's being deliberately open in a way that triggers emotional investment. And this is where many men get caught. They see someone sharing her feelings and they think they're being trusted. They think intimacy has formed. And the truth is, it has, but not the way they expect. Older men are wired to respond to need. It's almost biological at this point. Decades of life experience, responsibility, the sense of being relied upon, it becomes a reflex to step in when someone seems fragile, uncertain, or in search of guidance. When a younger woman shows a glimpse of uncertainty, a hint of emotional complexity, it triggers something primal, the desire to protect, to guide, to stabilize. But what most men don't realize is that the vulnerability is carefully measured. It's not a floodgate opening, it's a window. A carefully sized window that invites you in just enough to make you feel indispensable, but not enough to expose the full truth. It's this precision that makes it so effective. You might see a woman share a personal story or admit a moment of insecurity, and it feels like a genuine confession. And it is, in a way, but it's also calculated. She's showing the right amount of vulnerability to ignite an emotional response without giving away her full dependence or her complete intentions. And this creates a tension that men often mistake for intimacy. They confuse the desire to help with the existence of a real connection. They confuse the instinct to protect with emotional ownership. And this is where the trap lies. Think about it. When someone opens up about their doubts or fears, your natural instinct is to lean in, to offer guidance, to make them feel safe. And in that moment, you feel needed, you feel important, you feel powerful. But here's the catch. Being needed in this context does not mean being truly connected. It means being used as a stabilizing force, a reference point, a grounding presence. And the more you invest, the more you feel a bond forming. You feel like you're breaking down walls, reaching depths, and discovering truths. But often what you're really discovering is a skillful orchestration of emotional access. The brilliance of this tactic lies in its subtlety. Vulnerability is powerful because it feels authentic, it feels human, it feels irresistible. But older men, especially those accustomed to life experience, often forget that the mind is capable of being guided even when the heart believes it is in control. You see, when someone shows selective vulnerability, they are giving just enough to make you care, just enough to make you commit emotionally, and just enough to make you invest in a relationship dynamic that may not be balanced. And the more balanced you believe it to be, the deeper you fall. The mind wants to believe in fairness and reciprocity, but selective vulnerability exploits the difference between what you feel and what actually exists. There's also a philosophical layer to this. Humans are drawn to fragility because it mirrors our own hidden insecurities. We recognize it, empathize with it, and feel compelled to act. A younger woman doesn't need to expose herself fully to create this effect. She only needs to reveal the edges of her uncertainty. And older men, often carrying the weight of responsibility, desire to be the one to fill in the blanks. There is a psychological elegance in this interaction, one that can seem almost poetic. But when recognized clearly, it is not poetry, it is strategy. And understanding this is not about cynicism, it's about awareness, it's about reclaiming the center of your emotional world so that your instincts are not hijacked. Now, it's critical to emphasize that this isn't about deception in a cartoonish sense. Most younger women are not consciously plotting. This is often instinctual. Social and emotional intelligence develops early, and it thrives in environments where attention, admiration, and investment can be subtly directed. They understand that emotional openings create bonds. They understand that showing vulnerability in a selective way invites commitment, and older men, with their life experience and their confidence, are often the perfect target because they are trained to respond, to lead, to stabilize. Their natural strengths are exploited without malicious intent, but exploited nonetheless. The danger for older men is thinking that this dynamic is accidental or coincidental. It is not. Every gesture of openness, every hint of doubt, every glimpse of emotional need is a signal that triggers a cascade of psychological responses. You feel compelled to act. You feel compelled to reassure. You feel compelled to guide. And while these instincts are noble, they are also predictable. They are predictable because they are human, and strategic vulnerability is effective because it aligns perfectly with these predictable responses. It's almost surgical in its precision. The emotional opening is tiny, but the psychological impact is enormous. Understanding this changes everything. Awareness doesn't make the bond weaker. On the contrary, it makes you stronger. When you recognize selective vulnerability for what it is, you no longer confuse instinctive responses with intimacy. You don't automatically assume that being needed is the same as being appreciated. You learn to observe without immediately reacting, to care without losing yourself in the process. You become the observer of human psychology rather than its victim. And this shift is liberating, because once you see the mechanics behind emotional influence, you stop being a pawn in someone else's subtle game. You start being the master of your own emotional landscape. Here's the final crucial point. Strategic vulnerability is powerful because it activates something universal, the human need to feel useful, to feel necessary, to feel like a protector. And older men who have spent a lifetime responding to this need in all aspects of life are uniquely susceptible. The key is not to suppress that instinct. It is a beautiful part of being human, but to pair it with awareness, discernment, and boundaries. Recognize when your response is being guided rather than when it is freely chosen. Recognize the difference between true intimacy and emotional orchestration. Recognize the difference between connection and engagement. And in doing so, you reclaim the clarity that allows you to navigate relationships with depth, wisdom, and power. So, the takeaway here is simple yet profound. Selective vulnerability works because it mirrors your instincts back at you. It feels authentic, it feels intimate, and it feels necessary. But only by observing it consciously can you prevent it from guiding you unconsciously. Only by seeing the mechanics behind the emotions can you respond with true clarity. Only by balancing empathy with discernment can you ensure that you are engaging in relationships on your terms, not theirs. And the closing truth I want to leave you with is this: power is not about controlling others. It is about understanding yourself so deeply that nothing, not even the most subtle psychological influence, can move you without your conscious choice. Once you see it, you no longer fall, you stand. And standing in clarity is the most irresistible form of strength there is. The second psychological trick that older men often fall for, almost without realizing it, is mirroring wisdom. Now, this is subtle, almost invisible when it happens, but its effect is devastatingly powerful. Mirroring wisdom is not about flattery. It's not about pretending to agree with everything you say. It's deeper than that. It's a precise reflection of your thoughts, your ideas, your worldview, in a way that makes you feel understood, appreciated, even admired. And when it's done well, it creates an emotional pull that feels almost irresistible. Older men have spent years honing their perspectives. They've observed the world, made difficult decisions, survived challenges, and cultivated knowledge that comes from experience. And in that, there is a certain pride, a quiet confidence that is hard to disrupt. But when someone, particularly someone younger, mirrors that understanding back to them, it taps into something deeper than pride. It validates identity, it affirms competence, and it triggers a rare and powerful emotion, the feeling that you are truly seen. Imagine this: you say something profound about life, an insight you've gained through struggle and experience, and instead of dismissing it, she reflects it back with subtle nuance. "I never thought about it like that," she might say. "You have a way of seeing things that make sense in a way I've never understood before." That simple acknowledgement is not just recognition. It's a mirror held up to your wisdom, a reflection that says, consciously or unconsciously, that your understanding matters, that your perspective is unique, that you are, in that moment, extraordinary. This is where older men get caught, because we like to believe that age and experience make us immune to such influence. We like to think that our judgment is hardened, that we see clearly, that nothing can manipulate our perception. But mirroring wisdom bypasses logic and targets something much older, much more primal: the human desire to be appreciated, to feel understood, to know that what you have cultivated in life has real value. And when that need is satisfied, even subtly, it creates a bond. It doesn't happen instantly, and it doesn't feel forced, which is exactly what makes it so effective. The brilliance of mirroring is that it works on two levels simultaneously. On one level, it builds connection because humans naturally gravitate toward those who affirm their beliefs and validate their understanding. We are drawn to people who make us feel right about ourselves, who echo our thoughts without challenging our identity. On another level, it creates dependence because the affirmation becomes addictive. Once you start to feel the pleasure of being understood in ways that others don't offer, you begin seeking it more, craving it, even unconsciously. You start to unconsciously equate this mirroring with intimacy, and the two are not the same. It's also important to recognize the subtle intelligence involved in this tactic. Mirroring is never slavish imitation. It is precise. It doesn't replicate your words, it replicates your essence. It listens deeply, it understands the rhythm of your thoughts, it knows what points will resonate and what gestures will affirm, and in doing so, it creates the illusion of a rare alignment, a sense that this person is on the same wavelength as you, that they comprehend not just what you say, but who you are at your core. That is intoxicating even for the most experienced of men. There is a philosophical depth to this that is worth noting. Humans are social creatures. From an evolutionary perspective, being understood and validated within a group increased survival and fostered cooperation. We are hardwired to respond to recognition, to internalize it, to seek it out. Mirroring taps into this deep-seated desire. It is almost impossible to resist because it does not simply appeal to intellect. It appeals to identity, to ego, to the very way we experience ourselves in relation to the world. And the older you are, the more defined that identity becomes, which ironically makes you more susceptible. The more certain you are of who you are, the more satisfying it is to have that self reflected back to you with nuance and precision. Now, many men believe that being appreciated in this way is natural, even deserved, and it is natural. But what they don't always recognize is the intentionality behind it. When a younger woman mirrors your wisdom, she is subtly guiding your perception. She is showing you what you want to see, echoing the parts of yourself that feel validated, while maintaining just enough difference to keep your attention. You are being subtly led to invest emotionally without even realizing it. The more you speak, the more you reveal, the more she reflects, and the deeper you feel the connection growing. Here's a key insight that most men overlook. Mirroring works because it feeds a feedback loop. The affirmation of your thoughts creates pleasure in your mind. The pleasure encourages further sharing. Further sharing invites more reflection. And soon, without conscious effort, you are giving more of yourself than you might otherwise, believing that a profound bond has formed. You are emotionally invested, engaged, and even influenced. All through the simple act of reflection. The technique is elegant because it feels reciprocal, you feel understood, you feel valued, and you begin to assume that what you feel is mutual, but the reality is more nuanced. The danger here is mistaking mirroring for authenticity. You think, she understands me completely, she gets me in ways no one else does, and in some ways she does, but the depth is selective. The understanding is partial, crafted to encourage your engagement and commitment. You are not being deceived through lies, you are being guided through empathy, through subtle psychological intelligence. And that is far more powerful than overt manipulation because it feels voluntary, natural, inevitable. You believe you are choosing to connect, when in truth, you are responding to a carefully calibrated emotional rhythm. What makes this even more compelling is how it interacts with other dynamics we've discussed. Strategic vulnerability creates the opening. Mirroring wisdom fills that opening with validation and recognition. Controlled availability and emotional contrast then amplify the effect. It's a sequence that builds momentum, a psychological choreography that older men rarely see coming because it doesn't look like influence, it looks like mutual understanding, and because it feels genuine, it disarms critical thinking, it disarms skepticism, it disarms logic itself. Understanding this dynamic is not about becoming cynical or closed off. It's about awareness. It's about seeing the patterns clearly so that you can engage consciously rather than unconsciously. Awareness allows you to enjoy connection without losing yourself to it. Awareness allows you to appreciate insight without mistaking affirmation for love. Awareness allows you to respond to intelligence with respect, but with discernment. Because once you recognize the mirror for what it is, you are no longer merely reflecting in response. You are observing, evaluating, and choosing your engagement. The ultimate lesson here is that emotional influence often feels invisible because it speaks directly to our identity and our ego. Mirroring wisdom is powerful because it doesn't attack your defenses. It aligns with them, validates them, and then gently draws you deeper. It reminds you of who you are, while making you believe that the bond is entirely mutual, and that combination is irresistible, almost hypnotic, even to the most seasoned men. So the takeaway is simple, yet profound. The next time you feel a connection that seems unusually effortless, that seems to validate everything you stand for, pause and observe. Ask yourself, am I connecting with this person, or am I responding to a reflection of myself? Recognize the power of mirroring, and you reclaim your clarity, your independence, and your capacity to engage on your terms. Because here is the final truth I want you to take with you. Being understood is intoxicating, but being aware of why you feel understood is empowering. Influence loses its grip when it is illuminated. When you see the reflection, you no longer fall into it unconsciously. You choose whether to step closer or step back. And that choice, that awareness, is the most powerful form of emotional mastery there is. The third psychological trick that older men often fall for, almost without realizing it, is controlled availability. This is one of the most subtle and powerful strategies because it doesn't rely on words, it doesn't rely on overt gestures, and it certainly doesn't rely on force. Instead, it works entirely through presence, or perhaps more accurately, the deliberate management of presence and absence. And this is where older men often lose their balance, because what feels like unpredictability is rarely accidental. It is carefully calibrated to create emotional tension. And tension, as we know, is a driving force in human attachment. Controlled availability is deceptively simple. It's the art of being present just enough to create engagement, but just distant enough to create desire. She may answer your messages promptly one day and take hours the next. She may be warm and inviting in conversation, then suddenly seem distant, almost preoccupied, as if she has other priorities that you can't fully access. And here's the psychological brilliance behind it. Your mind starts filling in the gaps. You begin to replay interactions, analyze tones, speculate about intentions. And the more uncertainty you feel, the more emotionally invested you become. What most men fail to realize is that consistency creates security, while inconsistency creates obsession. When someone is reliably present, you feel safe, you feel grounded, and you know where you stand. But controlled availability thrives on the opposite. By being partially unpredictable, she activates a very ancient part of your psychology, the part that seeks to restore balance, to reduce uncertainty, to reclaim connection. Your mind is wired to resolve tension, and the subtle push and pull of controlled availability creates a loop that is difficult to escape. You want to reach her, to maintain closeness, to feel that warmth again, and that desire drives behavior even when logic might suggest caution. This tactic is not about cruelty or manipulation in the overt sense. Many younger women use controlled availability intuitively. It's not premeditated in a malicious way, but it leverages patterns of human behavior that are deeply ingrained. When someone is partially absent, your brain naturally starts prioritizing them. Your attention sharpens, your emotions intensify, and even your perception of value changes. What was ordinary becomes extraordinary. What was casual becomes significant. And this shift happens almost imperceptibly because you feel like it's your own choice to be more invested, when in fact the rhythm has been guided. There's also a philosophical dimension to controlled availability. Humans are drawn to scarcity. We assign greater value to what is harder to obtain. This is not a trivial observation. It is an observation rooted in evolutionary psychology. From the earliest days of human society, scarcity signaled significance. If something or someone was difficult to access, it meant they were worth the effort, worth attention, worth investment. Controlled availability taps into this instinct. It creates a sense of scarcity not through withdrawal of love or genuine care, but through the careful calibration of emotional presence. It is an invisible lever, pulling on attention and desire, turning engagement into anticipation. Older men in particular are susceptible because they have accumulated experience, wisdom, and often a sense of self-assuredness. They are confident in many aspects of life, but when confronted with controlled availability, that confidence can be tested. Their instincts to lead, guide, and protect, which are normally sources of strength, become tools in the hands of subtle psychological influence. The desire to stabilize, to reconnect, to maintain proximity becomes intertwined with attraction. And the more they invest, the more attached they become, not because of overt manipulation, but because their own instincts have been engaged and amplified. Controlled availability also intersects with emotional contrast in a profound way. When warmth is paired with brief absence, highs feel higher and lows feel more intense. The brain responds to this contrast as though it were a form of reward learning. You experience the emotional warmth as a reward, and the distance as a form of tension that compels you to seek that reward again. Over time, this cycle creates a powerful reinforcement loop. You are drawn in, not by logic, but by the rhythms of your own emotional system being subtly guided. And because it feels natural, it often goes completely unnoticed until the emotional pull is already established. This tactic can be both enlightening and cautionary for older men. On one hand, it reveals something fundamental about human attraction. It is rarely linear, predictable, or fully rational. Emotional investment is often guided by rhythm, timing, and subtle cues that operate below conscious awareness. On the other hand, it highlights the importance of self-awareness. If you are unaware of the pattern, you may find yourself deeply invested before realizing how your own responses have been shaped. If you are aware, you can engage consciously, appreciating connection without being swept away by automatic reactions. Awareness transforms the experience from a trap into an opportunity for insight and growth. Controlled availability also teaches a broader lesson about boundaries and autonomy. The power of presence is undeniable, but so is the power of absence. When you understand that the space someone creates is intentional, you gain clarity about what you truly value and why. You start to see the distinction between emotional need and emotional desire, between instinctive reactions and conscious choices. You learn to observe your own impulses, to recognize when you are chasing an emotional rhythm rather than engaging with authenticity. And that insight is transformative because it gives you agency in a domain where instinct often dominates. The brilliance of this dynamic is that it feels reciprocal. You feel like you are choosing to engage, to invest, to respond, but in reality, your behavior is being guided by subtle cues and emotional rhythms that you may not consciously perceive. The more you attempt to stabilize or restore balance, the deeper you fall into the cycle. Controlled availability works precisely because it engages natural human tendencies, the desire for closeness, the discomfort of uncertainty, and the pleasure of reconnection. And the older and more confident you are in other areas of life, the more your instincts respond, because they have been conditioned over decades to protect, provide, and stabilize. Recognizing this pattern does not require cynicism. It does not require suspicion of every interaction. It requires observation. It requires curiosity about human behavior. It requires self-awareness. When you see the right of presence and absence, clearly, you can choose how to respond. You can appreciate connection without being consumed by it. You can care without losing clarity. You can invest without giving up autonomy. And that awareness transforms the experience from emotional manipulation into conscious engagement, allowing you to navigate relationships with intelligence, grace, and power. Here's the core insight to take with you. Controlled availability works because it taps into universal human instincts, the same instincts that older men often take pride in mastering. It creates desire through tension, engagement through partial absence, and attachment through subtle rhythm. But it only works if you are unaware. Awareness is the antidote. Observation is the tool. Consciousness is the shield. When you recognize the pattern, you reclaim choice, you reclaim clarity, you reclaim power. So the final truth is this: presence is powerful, but absence is instructive. Desire can be guided, but awareness cannot be controlled. And your emotional responses, when illuminated and understood, become instruments of your own mastery rather than levers in someone else's subtle design. Controlled availability is not a trick to fear, it is a dynamic to understand, and understanding it allows you to engage fully, wisely, and intentionally without losing yourself in someone else's rhythm. Once you see the dance for what it is, you stop following unconsciously. You step into awareness, and suddenly, nothing moves you without your choice, and that is the ultimate power you can carry into every relationship, every connection, and every interaction you have. The fourth psychological trick that older men often fall for is something deceptively simple but incredibly powerful: idealized respect. Now, I want you to really pay attention here because this one is subtle, quiet, and yet it strikes at the heart of human desire for recognition. Idealized respect is not just admiration. It is the art of making someone feel unique, irreplaceable, almost elevated beyond ordinary perception. And older men in particular are highly susceptible to this because decades of life often teach us competence and wisdom, but rarely give us the feeling of being truly seen in our full depth. Think about it. Most men, as they grow older, develop a sense of identity built on experience, accomplishments, and responsibility. They have led teams, solved problems, protected those they care about, and navigated life's complexities. And in doing so, they often become invisible in ways that are subtle but deeply felt. People respect their abilities, but admiration, the kind that feels rare, genuine, and almost reverent, is not as common. That is where idealized respect enters. When a younger woman positions an older man in this light, she is not just complimenting him, she is affirming his identity in a way that is almost intoxicating. Idealized respect is often demonstrated through subtle behaviors rather than overt statements. She may seek his opinion on matters that most people wouldn't ask about. She may show genuine interest in his perspective on life, philosophy, or even everyday decisions. She may frame him as different from others, highlighting qualities that are unique to him, qualities that make him seem rare and irreplaceable. And when this happens consistently, the psychological effect is profound. You begin to feel elevated, almost mythologized, not just because of what you are, but because of the way you are seen. Here's the psychological mechanism behind it. Humans are deeply drawn to validation, but not just any validation. We are drawn to validation that confirms our significance. Idealized respect does precisely that. It communicates that your experience, your wisdom, your very presence carries weight, that you are not just another person in the world, but someone who matters on a higher plane. And this creates a form of emotional investment that is hard to replicate with ordinary interaction. When someone sees you as extraordinary, your mind responds. You feel needed, appreciated, and even admired in a way that resonates deeply with your sense of self. But this is also where the danger lies. Idealized respect can create subtle dependency without you even realizing it. You start associating your sense of validation, your sense of significance, with the attention and affirmation of the person offering it. The admiration feels good, and you begin to seek it more consciously or unconsciously. Over time, this can shift the balance of emotional power in the relationship. You are no longer just interacting with someone, you are responding to the mirror of your own elevated image that she reflects back to you. And because it feels flattering and affirming, it rarely triggers suspicion or doubt. Idealized respect is different from simple praise. Praise is momentary. It is often tied to specific actions or achievements. Idealized respect, on the other hand, is continuous, cumulative, and deeply personal. It positions you as exceptional in a way that aligns with your identity and life experience. It validates not just what you do, but who you are. And that validation is profoundly addictive, because it appeals to a part of you that longs to be seen and appreciated for the totality of your being, rather than for isolated accomplishments. This dynamic is amplified by subtle psychological intelligence. When a younger woman offers idealized respect, it is rarely overt. She doesn't need to say, "You're amazing." Instead, she frames interactions to highlight your uniqueness. She listens attentively. She asks questions that signal interest and regard. And she responds in ways that reinforce the perception that you are special. It is elegant because it does not feel manipulative. It feels genuine. And because it feels genuine, you respond naturally, without resistance, without overthinking. Your emotional investment deepens because the validation feels earned and deserved. Philosophically, this taps into something universal about human desire. All of us want to feel significant. We want to know that our existence, our choices, our presence matters. This is not vanity, it is the core of what it means to be human. Idealized respect offers a reflection of that significance, and when it is done subtly, it aligns perfectly with our natural psychological needs. Older men, especially those who have spent a lifetime carrying responsibility and achieving success, are primed to respond. The respect feels not just flattering, it feels essential. It feels like recognition of a self that may have been underappreciated for years. And yet, as powerful as this is, it is also invisible until you recognize it. Most men, caught in the thrill of admiration, fail to see the pattern. They mistake affirmation for intimacy. They mistake attention for alignment. They mistake feeling significant to someone for true connection. And in doing so, they hand over subtle power without realizing it. Idealized respect works precisely because it is almost invisible. It does not coerce, it does not demand, it simply affirms. And in doing so, it guides behavior, attachment, and emotional response. Understanding idealized respect is not about cynicism. It's not about distrusting every compliment or questioning every gesture. It's about observation, discernment, and self-awareness. When you recognize the pattern, you can appreciate connection without losing your grounding. You can enjoy admiration without becoming dependent on it. You can respect and care for others while maintaining clarity about your own autonomy and self-worth. Awareness transforms the experience from subtle manipulation into conscious engagement. There is also a broader lesson here about human relationships. Most people underestimate the power of perception in emotional dynamics. How someone sees you can influence how you see yourself. When you are consistently positioned as exceptional, your behavior, your confidence, and even your self-perception begin to shift in response. You may find yourself striving to maintain the image that has been reflected back to you without realizing that this image is, at least in part, shaped by the other person's strategy, and that is the subtle genius of idealized respect. It aligns admiration with guidance, creating a loop that feels entirely natural. Older men in particular need to recognize this because they often take pride in their independence, experience, and wisdom. And yet, even the most seasoned man can be subtly influenced by someone who mirrors their significance back to them in ways that feel rare, genuine, and deeply validating. The effect is almost hypnotic. You feel exceptional, and because you feel exceptional, you become more engaged, more attentive, and more emotionally invested than you might otherwise be. The admiration feels earned, but it is also carefully orchestrated. So the key takeaway is this: idealized respect is powerful because it taps into the deepest human need to feel seen, appreciated, and significant. It works because it aligns with your identity, validates your wisdom, and subtly guides your emotional investment. But the true mastery lies in awareness. When you recognize the pattern, you reclaim agency. You can appreciate admiration, enjoy connection, and engage fully without losing clarity or autonomy. You can enjoy being seen without being controlled by the reflection. And here's the final truth I want to leave you with. Respect is earned, but idealized respect is given with intention. Awareness allows you to see the difference. When you understand the subtle rhythm of admiration, when you recognize how significance can be reflected and amplified, you no longer fall unconsciously, you engage consciously, you appreciate connection without surrendering power, and in that awareness, you achieve a rare form of mastery, the mastery of self in the presence of influence, the ability to participate fully without being led unknowingly, and the freedom to define your worth on your own terms. The fifth and final psychological trick that older men often fall for, and perhaps the most intense of them all, is emotional contrast. Emotional contrast is deceptively simple on the surface, yet it operates on a level that is both profound and irresistible. It is the art of creating highs and lows in emotional connection, in such a way that your mind and heart become engaged, entangled, and deeply invested without ever realizing how it happened. And this is where older men, even the most experienced and self-aware, are often caught off guard. Emotional contrast is not about extremes, chaos, or drama. It is about rhythm. It is about timing. It is about creating a subtle dance between warmth and distance, attention and withdrawal, intensity and calm. The principle is simple. The human mind responds more powerfully to contrast than to consistency. Joy feels more joyful when it follows sadness. Relief feels deeper when it follows tension. And connection feels more profound when it alternates with just a hint of emotional distance. Emotional contrast leverages this natural rhythm to create a psychological pull that is almost hypnotic. Imagine this: you are speaking to someone, and for a moment there is warmth, laughter, deep connection. You feel understood, appreciated, even electrified by the interaction. Then, almost imperceptibly, she becomes distant. Her attention is not withdrawn completely, but her warmth is momentarily less accessible. She is slightly distracted, slightly unavailable, slightly elusive. The mind reacts immediately. You notice the shift. You feel a subtle tension. You want to restore the connection. You want to return to the warmth you just experienced. Your emotional system, deeply wired to resolve tension and seek ard, is now activated. And this is the essence of emotional contrast. It uses the natural architecture of human emotion to guide your engagement. What makes emotional contrast so powerful for older men is that it interacts directly with instinct and desire. Men who have spent decades cultivating experience, confidence, and independence are often less accustomed to emotional unpredictability in relationships. They are used to clarity, reliability, and logical structure. But emotional contrast introduces a rhythm that challenges those expectations. It activates curiosity, attention, and anticipation. It engages desire on a level that is not rational but primal. Your mind begins to prioritize her presence. Your emotions begin to seek the next interaction. And all of this happens without conscious intention. It happens because emotional contrast aligns with deep-seated patterns in human psychology. This technique is not about manipulation in the crude sense. It is often instinctive. A younger woman may not consciously plan every shift in warmth or attention. She may simply respond to her own emotions, social intelligence, or the natural dynamics of attraction. And yet, the effect is undeniable. Emotional contrast creates a pattern in which your desire, attention, and engagement are amplified. The highs feel more rewarding because they are contrasted with the lows. The connection feels deeper because the moments of distance make the presence of warmth feel more valuable. And you, as the older man, are responding not to a conscious manipulation, but to the architecture of your own emotional system being activated. Here's the psychological brilliance of it. Humans are wired to respond to reward and punishment, tension and resolution, presence and absence. Emotional contrast exploits this wiring in a subtle but extraordinarily effective way. It does not require drama. It does not require deceit. It does not require extreme behavior. It simply requires calibration, the careful alternation of emotional warmth and slight withdrawal, attention and distance, engagement and elusiveness. And the result is an emotional pull that is difficult to resist because it feels both natural and compelling. Older men often interpret this contrast through the lens of excitement or intensity. They may say to themselves, "This is chemistry, this is passion, this is connection," and in some ways it is, but the intensity is amplified by the contrast, not just the interaction itself. The emotional rhythm guides attention, focuses desire, and subtly directs engagement. Your mind begins to anticipate the highs, remember the intensity, and unconsciously seek the pattern again. Emotional contrast creates a loop that feels exhilarating, compelling, and addictive, all without overtly demanding your investment. Philosophically, emotional contrast teaches a profound lesson about human attachment and desire. We are drawn not just to consistency, but to variability. We are drawn not just to presence, but to the interplay between presence and absence. We are drawn not just to affirmation, but to the tension that makes affirmation feel earned. This is why older men, even with decades of experience, can find themselves deeply engaged in ways that feel unexpected. The pattern taps into instinctual mechanisms that predate logic, that predate experience, and that operate at a level that is both unconscious and unavoidable. Emotional contrast also interacts powerfully with the other psychological tricks we have discussed. Strategic vulnerability creates the opening, inviting care and emotional investment. Mirroring wisdom affirms identity and deepens connection. Controlled availability amplifies desire through tension and partial absence. And idealized respect elevates perception, making the emotional highs feel extraordinary. Emotional contrast then magnifies the effect. ensuring that engagement is not just sustained, but intensified. It is the final piece in a complex psychological dance that older men rarely see coming, precisely because it feels natural, reciprocal, and voluntary. Recognizing emotional contrast is transformative because it allows you to observe your own responses rather than being swept along by them. Awareness does not diminish emotional connection, it empowers it. It allows you to engage fully, appreciate the highs, and navigate the lows without losing your balance. It allows you to enjoy warmth without becoming dependent on it, to recognize tension without react unconsciously, and to respond with clarity rather than instinct alone. When illuminated, the power of emotional contrast shifts from external influence to internal mastery. Here's a critical insight. Emotional contrast feels compelling precisely because it mirrors the natural rhythms of human experience. Life is full of highs and lows, anticipation and resolution, engagement and retreat. Emotional contrast leverages these rhythms in relationships to create attachment, focus attention, and heighten desire. The intensity feels natural because it is rooted in the way humans process emotion, memory, and reward. And the older you are, the more finely tuned your instincts, the more potent the effect. The final lesson here is about choice. Emotional contrast is not inherently dangerous or deceptive. It is simply a dynamic of human interaction. The power comes not from the technique itself, but from the awareness and intentionality with which it is experienced. When you recognize the rhythm, you can respond consciously. You can participate in the dance without being led unconsciously. You can enjoy connection without surrendering control. And that is the ultimate mastery, the ability to feel deeply, engage fully, and remain centered, even in the presence of psychological influence that is subtle, elegant, and compelling. So here is the takeaway I want you to carry with you. Emotional contrast is powerful because it engages instincts, amplifies desire, and deepens connection through rhythm and tension. It works because it aligns with the natural architecture of human emotion, attention, and reward. But the ultimate power is yours when you observe it consciously, when you understand its mechanics, and when you choose how to respond. Awareness transforms influence into insight, instinct into choice, and attraction into mastery. And the final truth I want you to reflect on is this: nothing in human interaction moves you without your awareness unless you allow it. Emotional contrast, like all subtle psychological dynamics, only has power over the mind that is unaware. When you illuminate it, when you see it clearly, you reclaim your attention, your desire, and your emotional autonomy. You no longer fall unconsciously, you engage consciously. And in that engagement lies your true power, your freedom, and your mastery of self.